All right, Pastor Emmanuel, we're so glad to have you here, and I'm so glad to be sharing this morning dialogue with you.
I'm honored to be with you this morning and with folks from your congregation, BETH TORAH. It is good to see all of you, and our objective this morning is to just have a free-flowing conversation between a pastor and a rabbi. And what we hope to accomplish is to just create space where all of us know that we're loved, both by the community of people we find ourselves with, but that we're also loved by God, who is our creator. So I'm honored. A little bit of a history here with me and Dan. We go back about 6-7 years now. We have a common acquaintance in Steve Quill. Steve is the founder of Truth, an organization that is dedicated to bringing conversations or creating conversations across faith and religious boundaries. And so Steve was very instrumental. And the first time I met Dan, I believe, was at an Astros game, and he came wearing a Steelers yarmulke at an Astros game, which I think was a little bit of sacrilegious, but he got away with it. But since then, we've just developed an incredible friendship, and I'm so honored to share this stage with him this morning.
Yeah. So yes, we've both been honored guests at each other's house.
Dan, you're muted.
I'm mute. I'm not mute. You can't hear me? You can hear me?
I got you. Go ahead.
Okay. We've both been honored guests at each other's houses of worship. Pastor Emmanuel has spoken from the pulpit, where we've had pulpit exchanges. I've taught a few classes at Living Word and spoken at a Sunday service. And most recently, a couple of years ago, Pastor Emmanuel came on Yom Kippur, our most holy day, to talk about the other. As the people from Living Word and those who've met him at BETH TORAH know, he was a refugee himself from Liberia. And we learned a tremendous amount. You know, the Jewish experience understands the idea of refugee. But in your opening words, Pastor, you talked about the key word that jumped out to me was the word community. And these past couple of months have been a bit of a struggle in terms of being able to be in person with community. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the importance of community in your experience, both in your own church and in the greater community of the Christian world, as well as the world we share together.
That's an excellent question, Dan. Thanks for asking that, and I'll be interested to see how community continues to be formed and shaped at BETH TORAH. But for us at Living Word, of course, we're all living through extraordinary times. We've never been here before, and so oftentimes that sort of jolts the system when you go through times that are quite unfamiliar, and you kind of reach for tools that you've never utilized before. Here at Living Word, there's a wonderful injunction in the book of Acts, which is sort of the first. It records the history of the early church. It says the early Christian community, they were together and they shared all things in common, and they broke bread and they prayed in the temple and they cared for one another. It really sort of sets up a picture of people that were living in a time when they may not have had all of the things that they needed, but they also didn't lack in terms of the sort of cement that held them together. So what it paints for us is a picture where even though they weren't physically within sort of a confined space, the values that define them were still lived out in a very significant way. So the way church has been lately is we haven't been meeting, of course, on Sunday mornings. We've been leveraging all of the different sort of media that is to our advantage in terms of Facebook and Vimeo and YouTube to really continue to live out the message of God's love as we understand it through Jesus Christ. So that has been good. Also, it's led us to keep our eyes open for others that we encounter that may have fallen on hard times. So what we've done is that even though we're not physically together, we've kept our hearts and our eyes open for the needs around us. And the way we like to say that living word is that we are a living expression of Christ in the world. And it doesn't matter where we are. It doesn't matter where we come from. Everywhere and every day, we continue to be an extension of God in the world. So that has really informed how we've lived during COVID-19. So the physical gatherings are prohibited, but we continue to find opportunities to continue to be church even while we're away one from another. We've also been informed greatly by the blessings in the book of Numbers, where it says, may God watch between us while we're away one from another. I think it's called the Mizpah. So that has been a good source of comfort for us. So I'll be interested to hear, Dan, what is community like for you guys, knowing that you're not physically together?
Yeah, well, it's exciting, and if we're talking about the same blessing from the book of Numbers, we conclude every worship service with that blessing. And in fact, the way it's usually translated is, may God bless you and protect you. May God's face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May God's face be upon you and may you be at peace. And I've chosen the actual Hebrew is in the future tense. And I've chosen many times to do it in the present tense. God blesses you and protects you. The idea of community is essential in Judaism. We are at our most important times when we're acknowledging communal worship, and especially when we're saying goodbye to a loved one who's passed away. There's actually rules and regulations that say there has to be at least 10 people present. And what we've created now is we've created the virtual minyan. Minyan is the term for a gathering of 10 or more people. We've created the virtual minyan. In some ways, it has been very advantageous because we have in our community, we have in our community a great distance of people who travel a long way to come to the temple, and they're not always able to do it. And so with this, we've been able to reach out to more people who are distant. And we actually, as many congregations have seen, we actually get more participation than we did when we were there in person, because it's a hassle to drive a place, to go, etc. But you just log on to your phone or your computer and you're there. On the other hand, those who are less comfortable with technology get left out. And so this becomes our challenge in the isolation part, to be able to be as inclusive as possible. One of the things is we were talking prior to this week that we were talking a little bit about where does the Bible come in? How has that become a comfort? And the biblical narrative certainly has a lot about rising above adversity, creating a community where there was difficulty, beginning, of course, with the oppression in Egypt, where we were freed, we were redeemed, we were set out to be God's people. But the journey to get there started with that oppressive time where we were slaves in Egypt, and then through a difficult journey in the wilderness, and then going to a place called the Promised Land that was a difficult place to start over again. So even though it was the Promised Land, it wasn't paradise. It was a place that we had to farm, we had to conquer, we had to make it our own. And so these struggles aren't a new thing. This is the idea, and what excites me about the connection that we have between Christianity and Judaism. We share that blessing from the book of Numbers. And where does that blessing come from? The book of Numbers, which actually is chronologically in our calendar, where we're starting to, where we're reading now. We're just about to start the book of Numbers. We just finished Leviticus. And in the book of Numbers, the Hebrew term for numbers, it's not the Hebrew word for numbers, it's the Hebrew name of the book of the Bible, is Bamidbar. It's the first significant word in that book. Instead of using it from the content of the counting and the census, the Hebrew Bible chooses to name it Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness, because this was the journey along the way. And so here we have this blessing that comes about when the Israelites are journeying, they're traveling, they're concerned about their food, they're concerned about their supplies, they're concerned about their survival, and right in the middle of this comes that blessing. It's a very interesting passage in the Torah itself, because someone who's familiar with the Torah and familiar with Hebrew can pick it out. It's got a specific spacing in it, and the spacing is an arrow. That the arrow points to the right of what has already happened. And then we understand that this blessing is for what is going to happen. One thing I'm going to also mention, just on a logistical point, those of you who are with us on Zoom can chat questions in, and those of you who are with us on Facebook Live can also chat questions in, and they will be funneled to the pastor and myself. Did that answer?
Also, just a technical awareness here. We have about a 30-second delay when you ask your questions, so please be patient. We'll get to as many questions as possible. So we're hearing a theme develop here, the theme of community, but also a secondary theme of journey. And I've come to believe in my life and throughout my ministry that it's impossible to understand sort of the contours of the biblical narrative without understanding the power of journeying, because journeying is how we understand God. All of us on this virtual community this morning, all of us, we've come from somewhere. Most of us are not where we were physically born. We've moved. Life is about migration and engaging people and engaging places and engaging spaces. And the beautiful thing about Scripture, whether it is the Jewish Scripture or the New Testament as we understand, forgive my use of language, New Testament. Dan has a beautiful understanding of new versus old. I'll let him talk about that in a second. But whether is the Hebrew Scriptures or the Christian Scripture, I think what is true is this fundamental understanding that all of humanity is on a journey. And what makes that journey all the more bearable is the fundamental idea that God is present with us in the journey. In Matthew's gospel, when we begin to talk about the narrative of God present in the world as we understand it through the Christian lens, there is a name that we name God. That name is Emmanuel, which means God with us, or a more apt definition would be with us is God. I have a good friend who always says if God had a middle name, God's middle name would be with, right? Wherever you are, God is with you in the journey. And so I think that's something that is important as we have this conversation between our two communities, to really know that that what holds us together is the witness of God, God being present with us.
It's a very nice, nice sense of partnership, which is very consistent with how Hebrew works. That the Hebrew language is filled with contractions and abbreviations and prefixes and suffixes. And the word with, im, includes two of the letters from the word Shema, which is our most sacred teaching. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the eternal one is God, the eternal God alone. Or the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. I love that teaching about God's middle name being with. The letters that form God's name in the Torah are Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey, which is grammatically almost a future tense form of the verb to be. So when we talk about God as a living being, being can be a noun and a verb. There's a wonderful book called God is a Verb by Rabbi David Cooper, which talks about this in a Kabbalistic kind of forum. The other thing, in connection to what Pastor Emmanuel was saying about the old and the new, of course, we don't refer to the Old Testament, to the Hebrew Bible as the Old Testament. It's the Hebrew Bible. It is the Testament as far as we're concerned, just like my wife Lauren is not my first wife. She's my wife. But the other ways of interpreting things, another book I'm going to refer to, a friend of mine, Rabbi David Zaslow, wrote a book called Jesus, First Century Rabbi, where he talks about the comparison between the Talmud, the ancient rabbinic teachings, and the Gospels, neither of which had been written during the lifetime of Jesus, but might have been part of his upbringing. And there's my friend Donna, who has the book, probably because I recommended it to her. She's showing it in one of those little Zoom boxes. Thanks, Donna. There's another rabbi we've been learning from a lot at Temple BETH TORAH, Rabbi Rami Shapiro, who's going to be speaking at one of our Friday night services in early June. And I was reading some of his comments on his website when he was asked, who is Jesus in the Jewish tradition? He said, Judaism is the religion of Jesus. Christianity is the religion about Jesus. That Jesus is not a major prophet in Judaism, but was somebody, from our perspective, who practiced Judaism and who tried to model and live in a way that he saw was the right way to act. The other thing that I want to comment on or piggyback a little bit, actually we don't call it piggyback in Judaism either, but that's another story. With some other kind of back. But you talked about journey a lot. And the word for the path is derech. And when we talk about doing the right thing, the idiom for doing the right thing is derech eretz, which means the path of the land, the way we go. And it's it's like doing the right thing, that's derech eretz. It's a very, very common way to speak. And the prayer for traveling is called tfilat haderech, the blessing of the path. But there's another verb, and I really didn't intend to do a whole Hebrew lesson today, but it's really interesting that the word for Jewish law is halacha, which comes from the verb of walking. And so the concept of journey comes all the way through both of our traditions, that we have journeyed to the promised land. Our laws in general are about the path and movement, and we share the world. The other piece, and I'm going to pass it on to talk a little bit, is the idea of community. In Judaism, we have our community, which is the insular part of our synagogue community and the people who are connected in our geography and in our particular house of worship. Of course, in Houston, there are 30 or 40 synagogues. Different people connect in different ways. But then beyond our house of worship comes the greater Jewish community. And then beyond that comes the greater community that we share with the rest of America and then with the rest of the world. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about what community means to the living world, to the living word world.
Excellent. That's a great question. Of course, our community, we're here in KATY, and community is something that is constantly evolving, right? You constantly have to go back and to ask yourself, who then, in that great question, I think of a parable that Jesus lifted up in talking about, and there's a lot of, you hear a lot about it, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the essence of that story is to really wrestle with the question of who is my neighbor, right? What constitutes community for me? Clearly, yes, those who come on a Sunday morning for worship, we have 3 services, 8 a.m., 9:15, and 11. That is kind of that's one form of community, right? Because we're sharing the sacraments together. We're saying the same creed. We are singing the same hymns and all of that. So that's one expression of community. We also have, in our Lutheran world, we have sort of the local expression of the church, which would be the local church. We have the synodical expression, which would be sort of a collection of churches together, and our synodical bishop is Michael Reinhardt. And then we have the national expression, which would be the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and of course the global expression of the church. And so there are different facets of the church, and when it comes to how we relate to each phase of the church, we do that through, whether it's through mission support or through the prayers of the church, which we offer during our regular worship service, where we name the different expressions of the church. But even beyond just our common confession of faith, where a community becomes the person who is most likely to speak like you and perhaps believe like you, I think community is also those who are yet to belong, right? Because I think we live in a world where people want to belong before they can necessarily believe, right? And I think community is creating room for those who are yet to belong. A few years ago, we were in the Holy Land, and we went both to Palestine, and we went to the Palestinian side, and we went to, of course, the Israeli side, and our goal was to just have dialogue amongst both people. And one of the most interesting lessons I take with me from that visit was what someone said is our goal has always been, because we live in a system where everyone is the other, O-T-H-E-R, and our goal is to consistently add a B-R to that O-T-H-E-R, so that we're creating a community of brotherhood and not a community of otherness, right? And so I think there's a layer of community where we're living consistently and asking ourselves, are we creating room for that person who's yet to come in? Right? And how that happens, obviously, is different from each perspective. But at Living Word, we have sort of that nuclear community where, those who are on the roster of the church, and then you have the secondary layer within the KATY community and around our synodical expression, and then there's the national expression. So in our faith tradition, we have what we call the Revised Common Lectionary. Perhaps this is also true in Judaism, where it doesn't matter where you are. If you went to a Lutheran church in Latin America, or you went to a Lutheran church in Australia or in New Zealand, you will hear the same readings read on a Sunday morning. And so we have what we call a Revised Common Lectionary, which kind of holds us together irrespective of our geographic differences and all of that. So.
Well, we have a concept that we call Kalal Yisrael, which means the community of Israel. And so, well, we may have some differences in terms of practice, and even some differences in terms of theology in across the various movements, with the main movements being Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, but there's a number of other movements included. That the Kalal Yisrael idea is that we're all the children of Israel. And so that's the greater Jewish community and the common lexicon, as you put it. We would, if you were to go to synagogues in different places, you would hear the same words, but perhaps different melodies. When 25 years ago, I took a group of teenagers to Israel, and I gave them the choices of where they wanted to go on Shabbat. And they could go to, there were so many different varieties of synagogues they could go to. But the one that the teenagers chose to go to was the one that was most similar to the one that they went to back in Houston. Because there's a level of comfort there. When you were talking a moment ago, these little tidbits that you throw out, Pastor, just are so inspirational. The question, who is my neighbor, is a great one, because we have a responsibility. And in fact, there's the Talmud is the commentaries that help us expand the specifics of what to do. For instance, it talks about tithing, and it talks about charity in the Torah. Actually, there isn't a Hebrew word for charity. The Hebrew word for charity is tzedakah, which comes from the word for justice, which means that this is the just thing to do, the righteous thing to do. A friend of mine and I were talking just last night about the concept of gleaning, where we're instructed to, when we harvest the field, to leave the corners for the widows and the orphans. It actually doesn't tell us to harvest it all and go give it to the widows and orphans. That there's a sense of responsibility there as well. Leave it there so they can come and get it for themselves. It's a wonderful teaching because it's empowering. It's not that they have to come and beg, and it's not that we have to feel good about giving it to them. It's that all we do is leave it so that they can feel the empowerment of picking it up themselves. The other thing about who is our neighbor, in the tzedakah form, we do have an obligation to help our family first, our community second, and the wide world third. That we have responsibility for everyone, but you can't take care of the whole world until you take care of your own family. And the most repeated lesson in the entire Torah, the most repeated one, is one form or another, treat the stranger as one of your own, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. That we are instructed, and perhaps it's the necessity of the suffering that helped us understand that we need to be kind to those who are suffering. That we're not supposed to treat others the way we were treated. We're supposed to treat others the way we would have wanted to be treated. Now, interestingly enough, That particular commandment, treat the stranger as one of your own, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt, is repeated over 30 times in the Torah. But there's one time where instead of saying, many of the different forms are, don't treat him differently, or don't wrong him, or don't harm him. There's one time in the Torah when it refers to the stranger where it says, love the stranger as yourself. And that is in Leviticus chapter 19, which is called the Holiness Code. And why are you supposed to love the stranger as yourself? The punctuation of that paragraph is, I am the Lord your God. The passage starts with, be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And then each of the laws beyond that end with, I am the Lord your God. Love the stranger as yourself, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. We are instructed to try and strive for the holiness that God models for us. And that includes treating others the way we want to be treated, not wronging them, but then also the hardest part, to love them. And to have that directive and an emotion, like you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, and with all your being. To be directed to have the emotion is a very, very powerful thing. That here we are, and to love one another is a higher level than to not wrong them, to treat them kindly, to welcome them in. All those things are important. But then in order to achieve holiness, we have to love.
This is a good segue into the greatest commandment, which both in Christian teaching, and I believe it's captured in the Shema. Hear, Israel, the Lord your God is one God, and you shall love the Lord your God with heart, soul, mind, and strength, which Jesus repeats, and he repeats it within the context of this parable of the encounter with the Good Samaritan. What, if anything, could you add to that? How you relate to loving God, loving neighbor, loving self, which is sort of a functionality of the sort of the best ethics of life, is sort of this higher dimensional call of living God, neighbor, self. Speak to that a little bit from sort of the Jewish perspective. And if you could tie that into the question of who is my neighbor in the world in which we're living in, that being neighbor is no longer by geography. Now there's this virtual thing out there, right? Where at a push of a button, we could be neighbors with 2,000 people. How does that work? How do you understand that? How do you process that?
That's a very, very, very powerful question. Love your neighbor as yourself is absolutely in the Torah, and it's expanded upon by the rabbis of the Talmud. Rabbi Hillel was known to say, and in fact, this was the response to a question he had from a student who was challenging him. Can you tell the entire Torah? Can you teach me the entire Torah while standing on one foot? He was challenging the rabbi. And in fact, the first rabbi, according to the story, who he went to, said, don't bother me with your foolishness, and kicked him out of his study hall. And the second rabbi he went to was Hillel, who said, of course I can. What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. All the rest is commentary. Now go study. It's a three-part thing that you have to look at where you are, but then you have to learn more about it. All the rest is commentary, that we can boil things down to a simple statement: love your neighbor as yourself. But then we have to learn, what does that mean? How do we put that into practice? What are the specific things that we do? Going closer to your question, Hillel is also known to say, if I am not for my, it's another three-parter. And these three-parters, I hesitate to call it a trinity, but these three-part statements always have the power of each statement being as important as the other. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? If not now, when? That these are those three parts that say, I cannot help others until I'm healthy myself. So when you take it into that virtual reality that we're living in now, the power that we have to benefit the world and to harm the world is at the push of a button. That there's so much that we've seen, unfortunately, destructive, that goes viral. There was your friend Ephraim told me yesterday about a situation where somebody hacked a school board meeting where children were there and posted things that children shouldn't be seeing. There was a virtual meeting of the Anti-Defamation League, which watches out for prejudice against all people, where somebody hacked into it with a Nazi flag. These are the kinds of things where those with ill intent can try and exert their power. Those with positive intent can also exert power. And so when we create a virtual community, we have the opportunity to reach out in such loving, positive ways. And those with ill intent are really harming themselves, are really showing how this concept of loving your neighbor as yourself hasn't reached them for whatever reason. It's and it's a challenge. It is not an easy thing to be able to demonstrate caring, the caring that you would like to demonstrate with a hug, with a visit, over a computer. And we have to go back to some of the old-fashioned things, like putting a greeting card in an envelope and stamping it and putting it in the mail. The effort it takes, different than sending a text or an email. So people understand that there are people around who do care. And it's a major challenge during this time, and one that we have to continue to figure out. We have to not rely just on our technology. We have to rely back to some of the things that created us as a caring human community in the first place.
Excellent. I'm going to throw another one at you, Dan. Speaking of care for others, Jesus in Matthew's gospel paints this picture of the Last Judgment. And the Last Judgment in Matthew is predicated on this picture that Jesus paints of, he says, where the whole world is gathered before God. And the question is asked, what did you do for the least of these, right? And Jesus says, I was in prison, you didn't visit me. I was homeless, you didn't clothe me. I was hungry, you didn't feed me. And the picture it paints is those on the left and those on the right. And those on the right would say, Lord, when were you in prison and we didn't visit you? When were you a stranger and we didn't care for you? Or when were you hungry, we didn't feed you? And Jesus would say, inasmuch as you didn't do it for the least of these, you didn't do it for me. And then the same questions asked by those on the left. And they're like, when were you ever a stranger? Or when were you ever homeless? Or when were you ever hungry. How do you come at that in your practice? How do you engage people on the margins of society? Perhaps a good equivalent would be Micah 6:8. This is what God requires, that you do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly. Speak to sort of the Jewish approach to the marginalized.
That's quite a challenging question, and that passage from Matthew happens to be one of the few New Testament passages that I've been familiar with and have actually used in the past. Going back to the old and young, Rabbi David Zaslow in his book about Jesus refers to the Elder Testament and the Younger Testament. That's the way he brings it about. How do we connect with those who are marginalized? It is a huge, huge challenge. Personally, I look at it as everybody has a soul. And I do things in my own life. I visit inmates in prison, and I have a special love for those with mental disabilities. And we are taught to look out for those who are in most need. Does it always come into practice? Sadly, not always. It has to be an awareness. There also has to be a desire amongst those to make an effort on their own. You know, the widows and the orphans are supposed to not wait for someone to bring them the gleanings. They're supposed to make an effort and go get it. They don't have to harvest it themselves. They don't have to buy the land themselves, but they do have to pick up the gleanings. And so that piece of empowerment becomes a shared piece. There are those who are, for one reason or another, completely unable. They could be in a severe depression. They could be unemployed. They could have a mental or physical disability. And I love that passage from the Younger Testament about we serve God not so much with our worship, but with our actions to those who need it the most. And here's another three-parter. This comes from Pirkei Avot, which is the ethics of our ancestors. The world stands on three things: Torah, in Hebrew, Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim. Torah is learning. Avodah is the worship. Literally, it means work. So when they refer to worship as work, that is working on our inner self. That our worship and our prayer isn't because God needs to hear it, isn't because God needs an ego build. It's because we need to connect to our inner self and that piece of God which is inside of us. And Gemilut Chasadim, deeds of loving kindness, as the third pillar that the world stands on. This is that tripod that I've heard described as the Trinity, that each is equal to the other, like a stool that has three pegs. And so our learning and our worship are supposed to guide us to those deeds of loving kindness. There was a group of students who was asking a rabbi, what's more important, study or action? And there was one rabbi who said study is most important, and another who said action is most important, and a third one who came up and said study is most important when it leads to action. That this is the thing that the learning is about. You can spend all your time in a house of study, you can spend all your time in worship and prayer, and it must lead to doing those actions. How do we bring in the least we have to look for them. We have to find them. We can't always wait for them to come out and look for the gleanings. Sometimes we have to take an active part and look for them and see who's feeling marginalized. There's a wonderful program in the Jewish community through the Jewish Family Services called Celebration Company. And it includes, I don't know how many, probably 20 or more, of adults who are mentally challenged, who have a place to go every day. They make candles, they do photography, they make art, they put together bakery boxes for Three Brothers Bakery, and they sell these items that they make, and it supports the program and the therapists who are working with them. Here are people who are potentially very marginalized, who are empowered because they're making something and they actually get a paycheck. They actually get a paycheck that's a portion of what is sold, and some of that money goes to pay for the program and the therapists who are caring for them. But they feel good. They say, I'm going to work today, instead of saying, I'm going to some daycare program. And finding ways to empower the least with more than a handout, but a way for them to feel dignified, I think is key to it all.
Excellent. I'm kind of serving here in a dual role. So if there are folks from Temple BETH TORAH that you have questions for me, please go ahead and ask those questions in our chat room, and I'll get them. Dan, we have another question directed at you, and these are all from my folks. And so this is about how does loving strangers translate in regards to this sort of interfaith marriage, right? Perhaps a Jewish person marrying a Christian. How do you work around that? And then we'll come back and ask other questions. So if there are folks from Temple BETH TORAH, if you have any softball questions for me, you can send those my way, just like I've been throwing softballs at Dan. All right, Dan, go ahead, answer that one.
You call that one a softball, huh? So at one point in our Jewish history, we would have said, love them, but for God's sakes, don't marry them, which is much less the case now. When I speak, I've said this at your church, and I try and say it wherever I go. When I speak, I'm not representing the entire Jewish philosophy. I'm representing my interpretation and my opinion. The world has changed, and there was a time when it was completely necessary to stay in your community. In fact, I was counseling a couple just yesterday, a Catholic man and a Jewish woman who are getting married. Once upon a time, Jewish people and Catholic people are so strong in their traditions that they would be the first ones to disown their own children for marrying outside the faith, because of their feeling that keeping the faith is so important, keeping our peoplehood alive. The Jewish people have a long history of others wanting to destroy us. And so for a long time, the idea of intermarrying was about losing a tradition, was about losing numbers. Today, it's more about how do we embrace each other? How do we learn from each other? And so when a Christian and a Jew marry each other, they have an opportunity to learn from each other. They have an opportunity to learn about both teachings. It becomes a tremendous challenge when you're raising children and you need to begin to choose which tradition you're going to go with. Is the child going to be baptized or have a bar mitzvah, et cetera, et cetera? And I've seen many families struggle with this. And the thing that I've learned, the one formula, the scientific formula that works the most is to know that everybody's different, that nothing works the same for everybody. But when there's an open-heartedness and a respect, then there's the opportunity to learn from each other. It is difficult because there is a great need to strengthen the Jewish community. There's a great need for this community that's small in numbers, that's persecuted, to have the numbers. There's also a great need for mutual understanding. There was a time not long ago in America where a Christian person would be looked down upon for marrying a Jew. And it wasn't just about the Jew not wanting to marry the Christian. And there were restricted country clubs, restricted neighborhoods, places where Jews were pushed out of. And so wanting to get into that society was a great desire, wanting to be Americans. Now, I think that the important part is not about assimilation and becoming like the other, but, we talk a lot about interfaith programming. There have been some seminars that I've been on that preferred to use the term multi-faith, where we're not just talking about our similarities, but we're also talking about our differences. That the Christianity and Judaism are not the same religion. We share many, many, many of the same values. And so looking at what we have to share and where we differ broadens us all.
Excellent. Any questions from our friends from Temple BETH TORAH for either myself or for your rabbi? We have 8 more minutes, and so we're going to start wrapping up here. Are there any particularly pressing questions that you would like to lift up? If you would like to mute yourself, you can do so and ask a question. Those of you connecting with us via Facebook, you can still ask your questions by writing those, and we'll be sure to answer them. So as we wrap up, I want you to think, all of us, not just Rabbi Dan and I want you to think of perhaps a biblical call that you feel particularly connected to today. I love the injunction in Isaiah that says to see yourself as the repairers of the bridges, as the restorers of cities to live in. I think is Isaiah 58 or 59, cry aloud. And I think the times in which we're living in, faith is all the more important because however we can bring our faith to bear, whether it's through our public engagement or whether it's through our own sense of connection with God, I think it's absolutely important that we make those efforts and we make them as best as we can, because part of our faith is the call to look beyond ourselves. It's the call to see the world not just through the lens of its brokenness, but through our obligations to try to heal. And sometimes that healing is first and foremost perhaps the healing that needs to take place in our own lives and in our own hearts, but to not shrink from those obligations. We can't do it all. There's an old African proverb that says, "You do for one what you might want to do for 1,000," something along those lines, right? And each and every day that we have the privilege to be alive, I think we have a real opportunity to treat those we meet, whether they share our faith or they do not share our faith, to treat them, to see them, to acknowledge them with the dignity that God has created them with, to honor them for the journey that they share, however similar or however different their journey is from our own journey. And I think that's how we, perhaps in ways, both small and large, leave a positive legacy. And that's how we translate our faith, whatever the similarities or differences are, into sort of this practical application. And it's really easy to go through life and not see anyone that is different from me. I mean, I can choose to do that. I can choose to turn a blind eye to those who may be different from me. And I can conjure up any excuse I want. It takes real courage to find the difference, to celebrate the difference, and in some ways to embrace the difference, knowing that there is dignity in those differences. So I hope we can do this again, Dan. I hope we can find ways to continue these conversations, and find ways to say, yes, we may be different in the ways in which we worship, and it's okay to be different, and there is beauty in our differences. But at the end of the day, this call to acknowledging the dignity, acknowledging the inherent beauty that is life, and the challenge to look beyond myself and to see the needs of others. I think it's both the summation of the Torah and also the teachings of Jesus. So I'm going to give you the last word. We have about 2 or 3 more minutes. Absent any questions, I'm going to give Rabbi Dan the last word. So.
A lot of it that we've talked about today and we continue to talk about comes down to learning. And when you asked, you mentioned, is there a biblical calling? Those who know me know that much of where I get my strength is from stories. And there's a story about learning that I think just fits exactly what you were just saying. And it also connects to a teaching about a particular event on the Jewish calendar. At the end of the Sabbath is a ceremony called Havdalah, which comes from the Hebrew word lahavdil, which means to separate. We praise God who separates time, separating the holy from the ordinary. And in this service, it's the end of the Sabbath and the beginning of the rest of the week. And what's very interesting about it is that we're not abruptly ending the holiness to go on to the mundane. We're bringing the holiness into the rest of the week. And we do it with rituals. We do it with spices that stay in our nostrils. And we do it with a candle that's extinguished, but it goes, but has a puff of smoke, and wine that stays in our system and gives us joy. And so it's very specific about how we blend, that the Sabbath doesn't just end abruptly, but we blend it, and we take that holiness in with us to inform our being during our more ordinary times. And there was a rabbi who was teaching his group of students about when to do it, because there's a specific time that it's to be done. And it's to be done when day ends and night begins. And when does day end and night begin? According to this teaching, the day ends and the night begins when 3 stars are visible in the sky. That's when you're allowed to officially end the Sabbath, as long as there are 3 stars visible in the sky. So the students asked the teacher, so if day ends and night begins when 3 stars are visible in the sky, when is it that night ends and day begins? So like any good teacher, he said, what do you think? And they came up with guesses. Perhaps, Rabbi, one of them said, it's when from a distance you can tell the difference between a lamb and a goat. The rabbi said, a nice guess, but not right. And another said, perhaps it's when you can tell the difference between a fig tree and a palm tree. And the rabbi said, also not right. And so they kept on guessing, and finally they said, Rabbi, tell us, when is it that night ends and day begins? And the rabbi said, when you can look into the eyes of a stranger and see your brother or your sister. Until then, it will always be dark for us. And so we talk about. The stranger is the brother. And perhaps the best way to conclude is with that blessing we talked about at the beginning, the blessing from the book of Numbers, which says, along the journey, whatever the difficulty is, whatever mystery lies ahead, and whatever hardship came before us, God is with us. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. God blesses you and protects you. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'yichuneka. God's face shines upon you and is gracious unto you. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. God's presence is with you to give you peace. Ken yehi ratzon. May this be God's desire. Amen.
Amen. Now for all of our Living Word folks, just say a big hello to all of our friends from Temple BETH TORAH, and I will do a blessing for those of our friends on the other side. Thank you to everyone for connecting with us. So the way we're going to do sort of the virtual hello, we're just going to give a thumbs up. Okay, so all of our friends at Temple BETH TORAH, if you're catching this through Facebook, there's a bunch of thumbs up that's going up for you, okay? So just take that as all the love. That if you're catching this through Zoom, just do a little thumbs up here so that we know that we're connected. Let's pray. God, we give you thanks for the blessings of today and for allowing us to share in the biblical tradition, for allowing us to be one. And we know that your love knows no boundaries. And we give you thanks for Rabbi Dan and his community, Temple BETH TORAH. We continue to pray your blessings upon all of us as we go through this time, this unprecedented moment. May we always find the courage to look beyond ourselves and to see those that you've brought our way. May we live each and every day honoring you in what we do, honoring you in how we live. Thank you. In your name we pray. Amen. Thanks, everyone. We are going to wrap up. Dan, any last words?
I would just say thank you, Emmanuel. Your friendship is very, very important to me. And I know that we've all learned a lot today. In a moment, I'm going to stop the recording. I'm going to ask Ephraim. I want to give a shout out and a thank you to Ephraim Danforth for putting together the technical part of this. And I'm going to ask you to take us off Facebook Live, and then I will, if you can unmute people, give them a chance to say hello. I'm going to stop the recording on my end.